So we've now arrived at chapter 22, and this chapter concerns the preparation for the building of the temple. And there is at least one issue we kind of left off last time that dealt with the specific location of the temple site that I want to hit on here. Basically, the issue of Moriah, Mount Moriah. It'll come up again in 2 Chronicles chapter 3. But there we're going to be dealing with the actual temple itself, and I might not want to launch into it there either, because last chapter was so dense, and I believe once we get there, that will also be dense. I'll go ahead and throw in that discussion here. But let's just jump in and kind of work our way through this, as has been our custom here, and we'll just deal with this first verse, which reads, "Then David said, 'Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel.'" And in many ways, this is connected a bit with the preceding chapter. But let's just go ahead and take a look at the overview of this chapter. And Labashine pointed out that verses 1 through 4 are 51 words, or 3 times 17. Again, one of our divine name value totals. So it's 51 words. So if we were to look here, the first 4 verses, and it may seem arbitrary to cut it off here, but it actually isn't, because there is, in the Masoretic text, there is a open paragraph break here at verse 4. There's actually a closed paragraph break in the first verse as well, but there's a good reason to take these first 4 verses as a unit. And then let's make this smaller so we can kind of see it. The next section would be verses 5 through 16, and these would be, or this whole section would be 204 words, which is 12 times 17. Again, one of our other divine value totals. And then the last couple of verses, verses 17 through 19, are 52 words, or 2 times 26. And again, if you block off this section after verse 4, because you have that open paragraph break, through this whole section, you have the divine name Yahweh, the actual term itself, show up 17 times. So if you go count through all of the occurrences, it's 17. So you have the divine name, which equals 17, showing up 17 times. But anyway, continuing on, John Stone says in his commentary that this first verse here, the Masoretic text, places for emphasis in a paragraph by itself. Now gives the formal proclamation that David makes to his people. This new altar in Jerusalem is henceforth to be the substitute place, the definitive restart where oneness between God and people is to be realized. As a consequence of David's guilt, a paradigm shift has taken place in the mode of Israel's realization of itself as the people of God. A new balance in the respective roles of king and priesthood has been established. This is where the new house of God, with all its new specifications, rites, and clergy, is to be built. It is with this new temple that most of the remainder of the account of David's reign and of that of Solomon is concerned, down to 2 Chronicles 7. And you can't really emphasize this enough, that this really is the start of something completely different than what has preceded it. It's surely connected with the previous Mosaic laws, regulations, and worship and whatnot, but it is entering a new phase. And concerning this term here, that, the house of the Lord, Selman notes that this phrase, to build the house of God, which with small variations occurs 9 times, is the dominant theme of chapter 22. From now until the end of Chronicles' account of David, everything will be directly concerned with the temple. The context also shifts from David alone to David and Solomon, since the building of the temple is really a joint project. And concerning this language of the altar of burnt offering for Israel, Han is going to pick up on this issue that I wanted to get to, which is the specific location of this site on this threshing floor. Han says in page 92, "As God accepted the burnt offerings of Abraham in this place, on this same site, God in the future will accept the offerings of his people and grant them his mercy." Dillard observes, the chronicler not only adds the material designating Ornan's threshing floor as the temple site, But he also makes an identification of this location with Mount Moriah, an identification unique to 2 Chronicles 3:1. The imagery is pregnant. At the same site where Abraham once held a knife over his son, that's Genesis 22, David sees the angel of the Lord with the sword ready to plunge into Jerusalem. In both cases, death is averted by sacrifice. The temple is established there as the place where Israel was perpetually reminded that without the shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin. He compares that to Hebrews 9:22. He continues on, the divine oath sworn in recognition of Abraham's fidelity in his covenant test is what spares Israel in this moment of David's infidelity. So let that sink in. So Abraham was faithful in being willing to give his son over to God. Here, David takes the Son of God for himself in trying to muster the troops. Again, we dealt with this in the last chapter. So Abraham's fidelity in his covenant test is what spares Israel in this moment of David's infidelity. Because remember, he fails his test. An interpretation found in the Targum on 1 Chronicles 21:15. This is actually really interesting. When he, that is God, was destroying it, Jerusalem, he observed that the ashes of the binding of Isaac, which were at the base of the altar, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, which he had set up with him on the mountain of worship. He observed the sanctuary house, which was above, where the souls of the righteous are, and the image of Jacob, which was engraved on the throne of glory. And he repented in himself of the evil which he had planned. Obviously, this is nowhere found in this actual text, but it is an expansion on this idea, this connection between these two sites. And of course, they're tracking on this same idea of the faithfulness of Abraham sparing Israel when David is unfaithful. But before we move any further, I do want to land here and talk a little bit about some of this stuff, because we hit on some of this a little bit already, but let's go ahead and let's pull out the Greek. The microphone messed up a little bit in this section, so I want to redo it very quickly. And what we were tracking on is Genesis 22. And really specifically, we want to actually look at the Greek. And because in 1 Chronicles 21 and also in 2 Chronicles 3, we're given these typological connections as well as an explicit connection with Mount Moriah being evoked. And so that ties these passages together. Now, Genesis 22, the binding of Isaac, itself has a lot of typological resonances with it. So it becomes a very important passage itself. And so, for instance, let's go ahead and bring out the New Testament. Since most people think that Mark was written first, we'll just go with Mark. And if we go down here to the baptism. So in verse 11, a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." And it's this term here, agapetos. Now in the binding of Isaac here, you have this language. It's the same language of take your beloved son, whom you love, Isaac. And it in fact refers to him as his only son as well. In fact, we have a number of other passages we could go to. In Zechariah 12, I think specifically verse 10 or thereabouts, when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. But I want to look at this in Greek specifically. It translates it a bit differently, but here you're going to have the terminology of this beloved language, as well as this firstborn language here, which itself brings us back into other passages. I mean, Jesus is referred to as Colossians, 1, specifically around verse 15 or so, the firstborn from the dead, the firstborn of all creation. It's the same terminology. And in fact, we could go another place. Well, we want to be in the Greek here, but in Amos 8, I want to say the latter part, like verse 10 or so, verse 9, where it says, "And it will be on that day, says the Lord God, the sun will set during midday, and the light will grow dark, quite dark upon the land in daytime." So basically, it's referring to an eclipse, and it's going to use this language here, where And I will change your holidays into grief, all your songs into lamentation, and I will cause a sackcloth to go on every waist and baldness on every head. So in other words, they'll be in mourning, and I will make it like the grief of a beloved one, and those with it like a day of pain. So here, I mean, you have a tight connection to the crucifixion. Again, the beloved one, same term being used over to refer to some of these only son type passages. Again, it brings back to mind this language here. But keep in mind that all of these connections are relevant here, especially because we're dealing with this typological connection as well as the geographical connection of Mount Moriah, again, the location of the near sacrifice of Isaac, with the future temple site. And so that's going to connect all of these things together. And of course, typologically, Christ is going to embody a lot of these themes. A lot of these typological ideas get transferred over to Jesus because he is, the walking tabernacle. He is the one tabernacling among the people. And many of these ideas are going to be fulfilled in him. Another thing worth pointing out in this general idea is, let's see, where it has the firstborn language somewhere right here. And let's just go ahead and run a search on it. And as we can see here, the first reference, let me make this a little bit bigger. The first reference is Genesis 4:4, which is the Cain and Abel story. So Abel bringing the firstborn, of his flocks. That's the first usage of this term, as well as in Exodus. Again, remember the firstborn of Israel, or the nation of Israel. The Lord says, my firstborn son is Israel. And of course, again, the juxtaposition here, you're not willing to release them. Look here, then I am slaying your firstborn son. And of course, remember in last chapter, in 21, you had a reversing of the imagery where you had the angel was destroying Jerusalem as the angel destroyed Egypt and, the firstborn and all of that. And of course, the firstborn of Israel, or rather the firstborn that is Israel, was under threat. And so, again, like Isaac was, the entire nation was under threat. And like Isaac and Abraham, the angel of the Lord comes and intervenes and makes, offers the substitute. The ram serves as that substitution. And again, remember, the first usage of this idea of this firstborn language is Abel bringing the substitutionary animal. And of course, all of this goes to that location of the temple site being where eventually the animal substitutions would be used in the sacrificial system to atone for the people, that kind of idea. Of course, it never completely atones. You don't get that until you get the firstborn of all creation, the Son, the only Son of God, Christ. And so all of these images are brought together, but I wanted to highlight that because it comes up in that connection with Mount Moriah. It's because of that connection, you're able to then go forward and backwards with all of these connections that ultimately point forward to Christ. But we will continue on with the other video. David commanded to gather together the resident aliens who were in the land of Israel, and he set stonecutters to prepare dressed stones for building the house of God. David also provided great quantities of iron for nails for the doors of the gates and for clamps, as well as bronze in quantities beyond weighing, and cedar timbers without number, for the Sidonians and Tyrians brought great quantities of cedar to David. For David said, Solomon my son is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it. So David provided materials in great quantity before his death. And here I'm pointing out that this root here, the provided, in here, again, it shows up again, make preparations for it. This KWN root links us back to 1 Chronicles 14:2. Interestingly, the context in which David knew that the Lord had established him and his kingdom was highly exalted. It's interesting because this passage came up in the last chapter where David knew that God established him. Of course, David, remember, wanted to know the number of the people. But it's this language here of establishing him. As you can see here, it's the same root. And then again, the highly exalted language is going to show up again here with this exceedingly magnificent, the temple. And we pointed out in chapter 14 that, as you can see here, the root is ma'al, basically. And the term being, let's see if the dictionary has both right next to each other. It should. Yeah. As you can see here, I mean, you have the same root, but they mean two different things, basically a homonym. So you have one of these terms, which it's using here, exceedingly magnificent, or in the case of chapter 14, highly exalted. So it means that. It means above, upwards, above, exceedingly, great, high, all those things. And then the other ma'al, though, that is a key term throughout Chronicles, is treachery. It's trespass, unfaithfulness. Saul ma'al the ma'al in chapter 10. Ideas like that. So it creates something of a pun, where if the kings do right, they will be exalted. They will create things for God that are exceedingly magnificent. But if they fail, again, it's the other ma'al. There, it's a trespass. It's a great, deep violation against God. So kings can do one or the other, basically. And you get a lot of this in Chronicles, this kind of dichotomy between the good kings, the bad kings, and that kind of idea. And John Stone is going to point out here that the materials in ascending order of value, here, stone, iron, bronze, cedar wood, are to be resumed in verse 14 in descending order: gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, just as verse 15 corresponds to verse 2. So you have kind of this inclusio kind of, or chiastic kind of structuring going on there. Concerning this language of Solomon being young and inexperienced, the commentators have quite a bit to say. We'll actually begin here with Japhet. She says the description of Solomon as young and inexperienced, or in other translations, a boy of tender years or untried youth, is of interest. In the books of Kings, there is no record of Solomon's age when he ascended the throne, but only the length of his reign. His completely passive role in the events recorded in Kings, this chapters 1 and 2, may support the impression that he was still a young man at the time, leaving center stage to the older and more experienced protagonists. Also, in the account of his dream at Gibeon, he portrays himself with, "I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in." It's 1 Kings 3:7. Again, in Chronicles, David introduces Solomon to the people of Israel in the same vein. "Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced." Should these repeated references to Solomon's youth be taken literally? And Merrill above here basically takes it that way, takes it at face value, or regarded as mere literary conventions. Several scholars indeed accept the literal consequences of these statements and conclude that Solomon did not reach good old age as David had before him. So if you take the reign links and stuff like that, if he would have been 18 or 20 and reigned 40 years, he would have died at 58, 60, somewhere in that range. Although the persistence of the theme is impressive, we should also consider the evidence relating to the only other king who is described in Chronicles in similar terms. When Rehoboam was young and irresolute, and that's 2 Chronicles 13:7, which according to biblical chronological data applies to a man of 41 years of age. So her point is, taken at face value, yes, Solomon would have been pretty young, although the same phrase is used of Rehoboam, and he would have been 41. And for her, I guess she sees that as something of a stalemate. Like I said, Merrill goes through, and I think in his commentary, he footnotes an article he wrote where he goes through some of the chronology and arrives at this age, either 14 or 20 or so. I'm sorry, 18 to 20. What I find interesting in this discussion, especially with regards to Rehoboam being 40, it reminds me of a story that Cyrus Gordon told. And I believe it was within the context of the genealogies. It may have been Gary Rinsberg that told the story about Gordon. I don't remember. So Cyrus Gordon was doing archaeological work in like the 1920s in either Iraq, Afghanistan, one of these places you really can't do that kind of work today. And he told the story of how he was working with a man and his son. And one time, they were at lunch or whatever, and he was, just making small talk with this guy. And he compliments his son and asks him, like any Western person would, how old his son is. He's saying he's a good worker or whatever. How old is he? And the man replied something to the effect of, I don't know, God knows how old he is. And he said he could be 20, he could be 40. But then he told him, he was born the year after some independence was declared, whatever. Like he gave some historical reference to when around the time he was born. And that reference would have made him roughly a teenager, maybe early teens, I think he said, which is what he looked like. But he was kind of taken back by the fact that this guy, who he was saying in this context, the guy could have probably cited his family tree going back generations in ways that Western people couldn't. But yet he didn't even know how old his son was. And he gave this estimate of like 20 to 40, even though he was a young teenager probably. So I just find that interesting because it accords almost perfectly with this story here, where you have Solomon being 18 to 20 and being called a young man, young in experience. And you also have a 40-year-old with that same term applied. I don't think that we should see this language being used of Rehoboam as somehow undoing all of this other information that says that Solomon was actually very young. But continuing down in verse 6, he calls Solomon his son, charges him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house to the name of the Lord my God. But the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest, and I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies. For his name shall be Solomon, and I will give him peace and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son, and I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever. Now, my son, the Lord be with you, so that you may succeed in building the house of the Lord your God, as he has spoken concerning you. Now, I'm going to go ahead and break off here so we can begin commenting on this. And Selman is going to point out in his commentary that David's handover to Solomon is modeled on elements of Moses' appointment of Joshua. Moses and David's failure to realize fully their intentions is counterbalanced by their successors' achievement. But notice also the element of this, that this sets up a typological theme that is going to run until Christ, where you have, in a sense, the death of the predecessor, which makes way for the person succeeding them to then realize the thing. So you have, obviously, Moses dying and then Joshua fulfilling. You have here David dying eventually, and then you're going to have Solomon ultimately build the temple. Of course, Christ is interesting in that he is both sides of the element. He dies, but he resurrects himself. He continues on, conquering the promised land and building the temple were privileges, too great to be entrusted to one individual. And in both instances, the Bible underlines that it is God who plans the task and ensures it is carried out. The second is the repetition of certain distinctive ideas and phrases. This includes exhortations about the obedience to God's law and various notable encouragements, such as be strong and courageous. And here, again, he's listing the comparisons between the passages in Joshua and Deuteronomy, of course, as well as here. Do not be afraid or discouraged. The Lord be with you. The parallel between Joshua and Solomon is not a rigid device, since David has also been modeled on Joshua as one who completed the conquest of the promised land. The purpose here seems to be to demonstrate that Solomon's task was no less crucial than Joshua's and required the same qualities of faith and courage. But moving on, the commentaries have a bit to say about the fact that David is disqualified from building the temple because he shed so much blood and waged great wars. Because the commentaries find it a bit incongruent that David is disqualified for this reason, for being a man of war, because God gave him victory in these wars. So they think it's odd that he would be disqualified from building the temple because of the war. Some would really highlight this language of shed much blood, because that can be used more idiomatically. Like you get this in Ezekiel, for instance, where it doesn't mean the literal killing of someone, but it can mean that your poor actions or your poor decisions can lead to the death of others, and therefore the blood is on your hands, that kind of idea. And so they would tie that to the census in last chapter. However, I don't think that you can fully get away from the language of the wars he waged, because, I mean, it's right there. It's part of the context. I personally just don't see anything incongruent with the idea. In fact, I think Johnstone himself more or less answers it here with the corollary aspect of this. That is, Solomon, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. And I shall give him rest from all his surrounding enemies, for his name shall be Solomon. Johnstone points this out on page 241 of his commentary. This is the fundamental point here. The temple can be built because it is the resting place of the ark. Again, take this idea. It's the idea of rest. But the ark can only have a resting place when the Lord, whose symbol in war the ark is, has given to his people the rest which arises from the pacification of the world. The verb from the same root, to give rest, thus follows in the next phrase. The giver of rest is a stock conception for the Lord, especially in Deuteronomic passages, such as, and he gives a huge list, the particular wordplay on Solomon and peace, reflecting the theory that the name conveys the nature, is also unique, though the association is to be found in 1 Kings 4:24 and 25. The following word, quiet, is particularly associated in Chronicles with cessation of war or communal strife. And so I think that that's ultimately the answer. It's not that there's necessarily anything wrong with war. It's to be taken very seriously. And we dealt with that in the last chapter. There is a sacral dimension to war, but it did disqualify him, that is David, from being the one to be associated directly with the temple because it's the place of rest. But he wasn't a man of rest. But he was necessary to bring about that rest. So I think it's a very theological point. Again, we touched a little bit about this in the last video as well. It reminds me a lot of the Old Testament laws, where things that can make you impure were just parts of life and death. And so it's not a moral failing of David per se. And I actually have one theory about why this also might be the case, but I'm not gonna make it public because I need to find out if anybody else has made this connection. I don't like to be the only person that makes a connection because I tend to think that weakens an argument. It makes me nervous if I'm the only one who sees something because I think then I'm probably just seeing things. It's probably not there. But so I'll refrain from speculating on why else this might be the case, but we'll just continue. Concerning this language of so that you may succeed, John Stone's pointing out here that success is a divine gift, which is conditional upon seeking the Lord, defined here expressively in terms of obedience to the commandments of the Torah, verses 12 and 13. The verb becomes a thematic term for the reign of Solomon and for subsequent kings, and then obviously the contrast as well. Continuing on in verse 17, David also commanded all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon his son, saying, "Is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not given you peace on every side?" Concerning this language of help, Selman says, with two of Chronicles' characteristic phrases, the leaders are challenged to participate with Solomon. So continuing into Solomon's reign, the positive qualities associated with his father, they are to help Solomon, a term which strongly evokes Israel's help of David in chapter 12, and they must seek the Lord as David had sought him. David explains how to seek and what it means, or what it meant rather, in practice to build the sanctuary. As elsewhere, seeking is an act of obedience rather than a search for guidance. And David will yet again underline its importance in chapter 28. The future temple will serve a double function: to house the sacred articles, especially the ark, and to exalt the name of the Lord before the people. And moving down concerning this language, for he has delivered the inhabitants of the land into my hand. The land is subdued before the Lord and his people. Concerning this, Johnstone has Hahn has a lengthy quote. He says, in Chronicles, David is not granted rest, but by his holy warfare, Israel is given rest. David himself characterizes his accomplishments in those terms. And this is what we hit on a bit above. But continuing on, preparing to turn the reins of the kingdom over to Solomon, he declares to Israel's leaders, "Is not the Lord your God with you? And has he not given you rest on every side? For he has delivered the inhabitants of the land into my hand, and the land is subdued before the Lord and his people." In drawing up the order of worship for the temple that Solomon would build, David again affirms that the Lord God of Israel has given rest to his people, and he dwells in Jerusalem forever. And that's in chapter 23. In both of these statements, the language harkens to earlier divine promises concerning the land. Exodus 23:31, Numbers 32:22, Joshua 18:1. In addition to Deuteronomy's promise of rest and a dwelling place for the name of God. So the point is, going all the way to Exodus and Numbers, Joshua, Deuteronomy, this is the fulfillment of all that finally. We also hear a deeper sounding of the biblical tradition. The word subdue that David uses stems from the Adamic tradition and may suggest that in his conquest, the mandate given to Adam to subdue the earth has been fulfilled. Following the delivery of the dynastic oracle and a series of victories won with the help of God, David and all Israel have brought peace to the earth. They have made the world safe for the dwelling of God's name. Even the curious and unique expression used by Job, cities of our God, in chapter 19, evokes an era in which human society is ordered to the divine purposes. If you recall, if you saw that video, we noted that this was a unique phrase to this particular passage. You don't find this phrase used again. So it is a rather unique idea. And so it seems as if finally that this era is going to reach a unique crescendo, if you will. Although it will be a short-lived moment, they have in many ways finally achieved that resting place for God again, as was the case at creation back at Eden. Again, this is where everything was headed. After the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden, eventually we get to the Tower of Babel, we get to Abraham, and the whole point of all of this stuff, the Exodus, is to establish a place for God's name to dwell again with his people. And we're finally approaching that with the setting up of the temple and the whole temple system, its liturgy, all of that. And so that is chapter 22.